The scripture this morning is from the book of Acts, chapter 16, verses 16 through 24. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune-telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days, but Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. But when her owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. When they had brought them before the magistrates, they said, "These men are disturbing our city. They are Jews and advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe." The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates had stripped off of their clothing and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them into the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks.
You were sort of wondering, the first part of that story that Ella read for us was about the setup of that story. That Paul and Silas had been in this area of Philippi, and they had stirred up all this agitation because they had healed this slave girl who had been sort of telling and giving divinations and things like that. And then the story goes on and says that they were taken before the magistrates. They were severely beaten and thrown into jail. As the night went on, they sang songs in the middle of the night. The prisoners were all listening to them and sort of incredulously. An earthquake happens. The gates of the prison open up, and instead of them all escaping, they stay put. The jailer is so impressed by this act of love, because if the prisoners had escaped, he would have been killed by the Roman authorities, that he then hears the message of God's love and becomes a faithful believer. And this is the beginning of many stories that were set within that city of Philippi that started the church there, which is the basis of our book of Philippians. So just to give you a little context on that second video. There's actually three parts to this play. First part, Ella read. Second part is this, and I'll tell you about the third part a little bit later. But before I do, I just want to thank everybody. I had a wonderful, wonderful vacation. I want to thank Barb and Peter and Rhonda and even Claire from her convalescence and the rest of our staff who did a fabulous job in my absence. As you may or may not know, I left after the VBS picnic about 3 Sundays ago. I got in my car and drove all the way to Oklahoma. I'm not quite sure what John said about some guy coming from Oklahoma for the men's retreat, because let me tell you, it was a long drive. And a pretty wasted drive, but that's all right. But the wonderful thing is that my grandson was born later that Sunday night, very late that Sunday night, and I arrived the next morning, and gosh, that baby was less than 10 hours old, got put in my arms, and I absolutely love my little grandson Tex. We just had a marvelous time in the next 3 weeks where all I did was coo and cuddle and care for this family, and especially my new grandson. I got to hang out with my 2.5-year-old grandson who had his own earthquake. He wasn't quite sure what this was all about, to have a new baby brother in his life. And I have to tell you, though, the most delightful thing, I know all of you have had babies, that you snuggle that baby right up in that corner of your shoulder and cheek. Oh, I just loved watching him sleep and cuddling up and smelling that newborn smell. And when he would get sound asleep, I'd put him on my lap and I would just study every little line on his little teeny newborn face. And that song that you just sang, David, about a baby who opens those new eyes. I mean, I got to see sort of where light really didn't matter. And then finally he was opening his eyes, and I dare say he smiled at me before I left. But I found myself thinking about Tex and who is he going to become? I thought, I get the front row seat of watching this little baby grow and nurture and sort of the responsibility that's there. I thought about what will be his interests, what will be his hobbies, and right now every potentiality is available to him at all of 3 weeks old today. And I thought about, what's he going to be like? I thought about, who will he love? And more importantly, I thought, how will he love? You know, these last few weeks in family worship, we've been centering on that idea of love. Because, Jesus, when asked what the greatest commandment was, he answered and said, the greatest commandment is to love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. And because he couldn't reduce it just to one, he added, and he said, but the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And these last 2 weeks that we've been moving through family worship and where we'll go, Barb started us off with that first plank, love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. But we've been working through, and last week with love friend, and next week we'll love stranger, and this week we'll love enemy with the second part. How do we love our neighbor as ourselves? How do we define that? And don't ask me why, but after 3 glorious weeks with grandchildren, I decided to take the hardest of that loving neighbor, the part about loving our enemies. It's probably among the most challenging, the most confounding, and the most difficult to live out, this command that Jesus gives his disciples that you must love your enemies. That comes as part of a big and broader sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. It was said in a sort of a natural amphitheater overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And to those who were in the crowd looking at and listening to Jesus and hearing him, they would have seen the lake at his back and would have been able to see the whole array of the beautiful Sea of Galilee, which is actually just a large freshwater lake. In fact, if you take your left hand and hold it up, the Sea of Galilee looks just sort of like a hand. It's sort of got this sort of shape to it, and the Jews of that time really only lived between like knuckle 1 and knuckle 3. But all the way around the rest of the lake was evidence of Roman religion and cities and garrisons. If you looked over to your left as you were looking out at the Sea of Galilee and listening to Jesus teach the sermon, you would have seen the Decapolis, a city of 10 pagan cities founded by Rome and others, and a source of paganism that Jews were not allowed to go and would have been seen as hostile to the Jewish faith. If you moved around the circle of the lake at the very end, you would have seen Roman spas and baths and temples that were erected to Roman gods. And then as you moved your way around to say 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, you would have seen the city of Tiberias, the garrison that the Romans set up to protect this area and keep the peace. And if you continued all the way over to 3, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, just right on your line as you're hearing Jesus preach on the sermon, you would have seen the magnificent cliffs of Arbel. These are these cliffs that are right next to the water, and they jut up, and this had been the location of a rebellious stronghold when Jews in this Scrabble area that had tried to fight against oppression hid in those caves to do their attacks on the garrison and the cities in that area. And when Rome figured this out, they climbed to the top of that mountain and they set and built containers that allowed them to then invade those caves, which they set fire to and smoked out all the rebels in those caves. And as they came out, instead of arresting them, they threw them off the cliffs to their death. You see, for those listening to that Sermon on the Mount, which we think of as blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, all those wonderful things, those actually listening to that sermon would have been aware of the cost of what Jesus was talking about as he challenged them over and over again. He said, redefine anger. It's not just what you say, it's actually what you think in your heart. He redefines adultery as the soul that's infected with lust and greed. He goes on and talks about retaliation and says, if someone slaps you across the cheek, let somebody slap you again. Or if a person asks you to walk an extra mile or takes your cloak, which would have been a reference to what any Roman soldier could have done to any one of them as a private citizen, at any moment could have demanded that they carry their goods, offer whatever they had to them in service to Rome. Jesus basically says, step back. Not only do what they ask, but go the extra mile. And if this hadn't inflamed them enough, those sitting in that wonderful amphitheater hearing from this first century preacher who was confounding them, confusing them, confronting them, challenging them, Jesus says this: if you have heard it said that you should love your friends and hate your enemy, but I say to you, you should love your enemy. And Jesus goes on and he says, hey, Even the Gentiles love their friends. That doesn't make them special. And he implies that to go on and to love your enemy is a mark of being a child of God. To be part of this kingdom that he's talking about means you must take that courageous step to love your enemy. And he said this to a group of people who saw evidence and felt the presence of that enemy from every sight line that they heard as they listened to him teach. Now, why on earth would Jesus say such a thing? What was behind the teaching that he's talking about? And if you read through the Gospels and read through the letters in the New Testament, you get a much more full picture of this. And I think it's true to say that what Jesus knew is something that I think all of us know as well, is that hatred breeds more hatred. Hatred is what ushers in a greater evil in the world. It's that kind of thing that snowballs and escalates. Have you ever watched a playground confrontation? Somebody hits somebody, then you hit them back, and then what do? You hit them harder, and they hit you harder. And you know what? Those fights never stop, do they? Unless someone intervenes, generally. Or someone stands back and stands down. A very hard thing to do when someone is attacking you. The nature of hate is that it escalates. It gets more intense. It doesn't start off at a low level and just stay there. It builds momentum, it builds steam. In fact, hate is one of those things that's like a big emotional black hole that once you start with that person or object or ideology or people group or cultural thing or whatever it is that you hate, it sucks in everything around it. How many of us have found ourselves disliking someone and then we find ourselves disliking the people who like the person that we dislike? Or we start to dislike the things they think about or talk about or read or do or whatever. We just pull all of it into that big black hole of hate, and it's really easy. It becomes really binary. They're either 100% awful or they're 100% good. That black and white thinking that hate sort of leads us to do, right? There's no in between with hate because it snowballs. And soon we're suffocated only by the feelings of hatred and our perceptions that all is wrong with that person, that ideology, that thing, that culture, that religion, whatever it has to be. It's the nature of hate. And Jesus knew that. He knew that consuming nature, that compounding quality that hate has. And you know who else knew that? The main character in our story today, Paul. Because you know what? Paul was sort of like one of the most vicious and violent haters there had been. You see, the Paul in this story is still the same Paul who in the opening chapters of the book of Acts, in Acts 7 to be precise, was the one who actually affirmed the killing of the first martyr of the Christian church, Stephen. Stephen had been appointed in the early church to be a deacon and was known to being a loving and generous person. He was teaching and sharing his faith and talking about the love of God, but this so inflamed the religious leaders at the time. Those very religious leaders who had disliked and hated Jesus, now Stephen, associated with Jesus, he got pulled into that black hole. And now they were enraged, and their hate bred the hate of the crowd. And before you know it, Stephen is being dragged out to the edge of the city. And against all morals and against all legal principles of the day, this crowd is so enraged that they begin to rip off their cloaks and they begin to stone Stephen. And in Acts 7, it says, Paul stood there while those cloaks were being thrown down. And the chapter ends saying, and Paul approved the murder of Stephen. You see, that's hate. Hate builds on itself. It can't go anywhere but towards more hatred. Jesus knew this. Paul experienced it. But Jesus also knew something else about hate. And that hate not only builds on itself, but that hate infects the person who hates. It changes the personality of the hater. You see, when we hate, it distorts our thinking. We get into what I just described as this binary. There's either all good or all bad. There's no middle ground. And in our own need to confirm the evil there or the bad that we see in a person, we reinterpret everything they do to confirm our bias towards that evil or towards that wrong. We grow irrational. We throw objectivity into that big black hole of hate, along with empathy and perspective. It becomes that thing that just consumes us, and people start acting in ways they can never imagine, and Paul knew this too. Because while he approved of the condemnation of Stephen, he gets ramped up and it changes his personality and who he was. A man who had spent his entire youth studying the religious law now becomes not just a defender of that law, but becomes a malevolent persecutor of the early church. It says that he dragged people out of their homes, early Christian believers. These are Jewish believers, people that were part of his family and ethnic group. He made them the enemy, and he wreaks violence in their lives. That local movement, he gets to expand to a regional movement, and he then gets official sanction to go out to all the synagogues and begin to pull and drag these Christians out of their homes. He has their names, he has their crimes, and by golly, despite the fact that they have done nothing wrong except believe or trust or follow the teachings of Jesus, Paul irrationally and viciously pursues them to their demise. That is, until Paul finds his way on one of those junkets, those hating junkets on the way to Damascus. The same Damascus in modern Syria was the same ancient city of Damascus in ancient Syria. And on that road, he has an incredible encounter with the person of Christ himself. And that shift and that change, instead of Christ meeting Paul with hate, Christ meets Paul, the story says, with love and with grace. And then the Christians, the very ones he was going to arrest and throw into prison, open their homes up and welcome Paul in and show him hospitality and teach him and model him about the love and grace of Christ. Because you see, what Jesus knows is that hate feeds on itself and that hate can distort the personality of a hater. Jesus also knows that love can redeem and transform us. You see, hate never can lead to love. The only thing that can break that cycle of hate, the only thing that can heal that distorted thinking is love, which brings the possibility of something new, of a change, of a transformation that could happen. I wonder about the nature of that love, that courageous, stunning, so against everything in our nature that requires that we see things from a different perspective, from God's perspective, how much that can change that cycle of hate. You see, when people hate, they turn what's beautiful into something ugly, and they say what's ugly is now beautiful. They shift and change, and they think that things that are justice, they misperceive now as injustice, and injustice is perceived as good, and what is true, they actually now say is false, and what is false now becomes true. I mean, is that the world that we want to live in? Is it the world that God wants us to live in? And the only way to break this is through the power of love. Now, I wonder about this because it sounds so sort of romantic and sentimental. But you see, those seeds of love that get planted by those of us who choose to love and not plant can make a powerful difference. You see, Paul saw and witnessed love in a way that he didn't recognize at the time, but I'm sure upon reflection knew and came to recognize that as the love of God. Because you see, when I told you that story about Stephen, I left out one part of it. The amazing thing about that story is as Stephen's uttering his last breath, the first Christian martyr, with all the crowd around standing and with Paul standing there approving, Stephen's last words are, "Lord, don't hold this sin against them." You see, Paul saw and witnessed the forgiving power of love in Stephen's story. And that may have set and plowed the ground and tilled the ground so that Paul could experience the redeeming love of God on that road to Damascus himself. But then the real proof of his faith came when he began to live that transforming love of God that night in that jail in Philippi, when having been beaten and been starved and locked in chains and in utter darkness, shifts his attention not to his enemy, but instead to the loving nature of God. And when the earthquake happens, which you think would have been, whoopee-hoo, let's get out of here, let's go, chooses to stay because he sees his jailer as a human being who needs this love of grace, instead of the very jailer who had beat him and put him in stocks as someone who was entitled to revenge. A love that is forgiving, a love that is redeeming, a love that is transforming is a love that I think all of us would love to experience and would love to share and would love to be a part of. But how are we going to do that? Really easy to say all these words, but how are we actually going to get there? So I have a few suggestions. Number one, take a hard look at yourself. You know, the truth of it, you have to be real about this. Be real, admit, not everybody's going to like you. Sometimes that happens. You're going to do things and say things, even in the most loving way, that are going to aggravate people. And people aren't going to like you or love you or care about you or value you or whatever. And you've got to stop defining yourself by the way other people see you. Allow yourself to be seen as a person who has value in the image of God and live out of that center instead of the center of being defined by how others see you. Take a good look at yourself and be freed of others' opinions of you. And then secondly, get honest, brutally honest with yourself. Take a look at those relationships that have been broken or that you have expressed hatred or someone's expressed hatred towards you, and get real and get honest with yourself. Do you have any responsibility in this? What's your part that you've played? What have been the blind spots or the biases in your own lives that may have led to this? And then act in a loving way. Do something about it. Get real. Get honest with yourself in all of this. But at the end of the day, there's still going to be people that you may not like and people may not like you. So how are you going to flip from those who really have betrayed you or acted horribly towards you or have categorized you or marginalized you for a group that you belong to, whether it's a cultural group, a sexual orientation group, or whatever it may be? My second suggestion is, after you take a look at yourself, is try to find something good about the person who's hating on you. Try to get out of that binary thinking that they're 100% evil or there's no good in them. There probably is some giftedness or some value that they have brought to the table. Try to focus in on something good and allow that little teeny tiny seed to maybe expand and grow. And when hatred is coming your way, try to reframe what you're seeing or experiencing in light of that. But if that's too difficult, and sometimes it is, then plan B would be, okay, try to just see them as a human being. Is there something about their common humanity that you share? Is there something about their history or their culture that can bring some insight or understanding? Try to figure out, are there places where you can connect with a common humanity, seeing them as human beings rather than as completely foreign, allowing your speech and your action just to embrace a common humanity. But that might be too difficult too, right? I get that. I've been in that place where even that has been hard. Like, oh, I'm so aggravated, so angry. It's been such a betrayal. So if seeing something good or trying to appeal to their common humanity, maybe you take it to a spiritual level and you just say, okay, I'm just going to acknowledge that this person is created in the image of God. I'm going to look for the divine in them, some element or quality about them that says, okay, God, I see something of you in them. I can't see something about a common humanity. I can't see something good, but I'll acknowledge that they were created in your image. And folks, even if that's too hard, sometimes it is, but I would encourage you then to just do the visual exercise of seeing Jesus between you and that person. Don't even look at that person anymore. See Jesus in between you and that place of hatred, and focus on Jesus and say, Jesus, you can love them. I'm going to love you. And hopefully, eventually, you'll get through and be able to see the ways that Jesus loves that person. Get honest with yourself. Take a look at yourself. Try to see something good. Try to act out of that, whatever that it is that you see. But many times when Christians talk about this is where they stop. And here's where Act 3 of the story comes in. You see, there was the story of the slave woman who gets healed. Then Paul and Silas are thrown in jail, and we have this magnificent story of the conversion of the Philippian jailer. But there's a third suggestion that I want to make, and that is that love still means you can stand up for justice and claim what is wrong and work to fix evil. Loving your enemy does not mean rolling over and tolerating what is intolerable. It means that there are times that you stand up for yourself, you stand up for what's right, you stand up for justice. And Act 3 in the story, which we didn't read, goes on like this. It says that after the Philippian jailer and his family all come to Christ and they all become believers, the magistrates of that town now show up as part of central casting in this story. And it says that they say, oh, well, sorry, Paul and Silas, go on your way. And Paul and Silas say, we're Roman citizens. We were entitled to be treated differently. You don't get to beat a Roman citizen unless they've had a trial. You don't get to imprison a Roman citizen unless they've had a hearing. And you didn't do any of these things. You see, they stood up for still what was righteous. What they didn't do was personalize their hatred for the people who had been involved, but they still stood for the principles of righteousness and justice, and we are called to do the same. We have to take a look at ourselves. We have to look and see and depersonalize the person and try to see something good or positive or spiritual or some glimpse of something that can shift our thinking away from total evil to the possibility of something changing. But we still are called to speak what is true and stand up for what is right. And when we do that, you see, the cycle of hatred can be broken. Because hatred still needs to be named and evil still needs to be called out. The hatred that we feel and gets perpetuated, the distortions that come, can be broken wide open by the acts of love towards another person. The great Martin Luther King had this to say in a civil rights sermon that he gave in Alabama many years ago, in the height of the civil rights movement. It's a sermon that's on this very topic of hating your enemies. And when I heard this sermon by Martin Luther King, I was reminded of the pictures in my head of the civil rights movement, of them standing in line and standing for what is right, and with the vicious, vitriolic hate that these still photographs sort of captured. Think about that as you hear Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. If you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem or transform them. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. Just keep on loving people, even though they're mistreating you, and the power of your love will break down under their load. It may not happen instantaneously. It may never happen in your viewing, but you're responsible for who you are, for allowing the Spirit of God to come in, and in your experiencing love and living out of love changes you. And that can be transforming, and that can be redeeming. When I held little Tex on my shoulder, and I thought about the wonder of this newborn life, I was so grateful. So grateful for so many blessings that God has given in my life. But I was aware of the profound responsibility I hold as his grandmother, and how those around him hold a responsibility. Well, what will we teach him? And as he comes into a world that is characterized by division and hatred and categories that are not helpful, I found myself thinking, what would be the most profound things I could be called to teach him? What would be the things that he needs to see modeled in my life? Love, the love of God, the love of friend, the love of stranger, but most profoundly, the thing that is unique to our faith would be to demonstrate and live and show and teach him about how to love his enemies. Amen.